So great to be with you, great to be at the Hank Centre. I have this new book, that's why I'm here on this rather crazy 3-week tour. It has a very different title from the biography that came out in 2014, which was called The Great Reformer. This is called Wounded Shepherd, which has a very different feel about it. I was with Pope Francis, I keep saying last week, but it's now 2 weeks ago, right at the end of the Synod on Amazonia. I was there in Rome for the whole of that. I had Mass with him at the 7 o'clock Mass, and then I presented the book afterwards. And I explained to him the title. I said, I hope you like it, because you said that in October 2018, Francis was talking to some French priests about the sex abuse crisis, and he said, we mustn't be afraid to be a wounded church, to look upon the wounds of the church, not to lament them, but to be led to where Christ is. And I was very, very struck by that quote. So I said that to him, and I said, you've said we need to be a church of wounds, so I thought you wouldn't mind being called the Wounded Shepherd. He said, no, that's good. He said, it's good, I like it. So I'm pleased by that. The subtitle is provocative. We writers like provocative titles. It gives us things to talk about in interviews. And the word convert is slightly different from the word reform, which I've used before. And it really reflects my deeper understanding of his role. So I begin the book by talking about a 45-minute meeting I had with him last year, so that's June 2018, which he asked for. And I'd seen him before various times, and he knew who I was, but it was the first time we'd ever sat down together for 45 minutes. It was an unforgettable meeting. And he began by, well, the first thing he did was to thank me for taking the time to come and see him, which completely floored me. And the second thing he said was, I've read various things that you've written about me, and I just have one criticism. So I thought of all the mistakes I've made, and I braced myself, and he said, I think you're too kind to me. So I laughed, and I said, I promise to be tougher on you in future. And he liked that. But then he went on to say something which stuck with me afterwards when I thought about it. He said, when I was elected in 2013, I didn't have a plan. I didn't come with a plan. I had a suitcase ready to go back to Buenos Aires. And I've been kind of managing the best I can, he says in that very humble way. And it made me think that of something that Father Antonio Spadaro, the Jesuit commentator who is very close to Francis, he told me that he once said to Francis, do you consider yourself a reformer? And his answer was, no, I think what I'm trying to do is put Christ at the center of the church, and the reforms follow from that, the changes follow from that. So the image that I've used in the book quite a lot is he's almost like, rather than a kind of a figure who appears at a moment of crisis with a plan which he's imposing, he's more like the director of a Jesuit retreat. Any of you who have ever been on the Ignatian exercises knows you have a spiritual director who accompanies you, provides the space for you, points out the obstacles and the temptations. But really it's God, it's the Holy Spirit that changes you. So this is the metaphor I've used, that he's almost like a spiritual director leading the church on a retreat. The call to change in this pontificate is really what this book sets out to look at. So the question that I was always asked after the biography came out, what does Francis want? What is he trying to change? And of course, how you answer that question depends a lot on your view of the pontificate. As you know, we have a lot of critics of this pontificate who answer that question, as does Ross Douthat in that book that he wrote a couple of years ago now, to change the church. It's a negative appraisal of Francis, that he's seeking in some way to change Christian doctrine or to dilute the Christian offer and so on. That's obviously not my reading, and it's not my response. But what is the change in this pontificate? What is new? So in these remarks, really what I'm going to focus in on is what my conclusion after 3 or 4 years of following this Pope, writing a lot about him, meeting him, talking to people very close to him. And I begin the book by saying that Francis isn't just a Pope of the people, for the people, but above all, he's a Pope with the people. That this affinity, this identification, which is demonstrated in word and deed and gesture, but also very much in his teaching, arises from a conviction deep in his heart that the people of God are the protagonists of the kingdom of God. They are the theological locus of God's action in history. In other words, he's taking very seriously the idea in Lumen Gentium that the church is the people of God. So that means that, above all, he's seeking to bring the church closer to humanity, to the people, so that the institution of the church and the people of God need to be in a very close relationship. That, in essence, the institution exists to serve the people rather than the other way around. And from this follows the overall aim of all his changes, of all his reforms, which is to enable the church to be close and concrete. That's the title of one of the chapters. Close and concrete, because these are the adjectives, of course, of the incarnation. God becomes present in humanity by taking on the form of a family, of a culture, of a language. That's how close the incarnation is, inserted in culture and in history. That evangelization depends on this capacity of the church to be inserted. That the major obstacle to evangelizing is the church's distance, the temptations of power, of knowledge, of self-referentiality. So that the call to the church, which is termed in Aparecida and in Evangelii Gaudium pastoral conversion, is really about this. That pastorality isn't kind of a way of being a priest, but rather it is an expression, it is the imitation of Christ himself. That to follow Jesus in the invitation of the kingdom is to always respond, if you like, to the demand of the faithful people of God. And it's to act within the limits, it's to act within the poverty of the human condition. It's to obey what he called as a Jesuit the urgency of the concrete. It's to recognize that God is already present in his people, and that the people is already in a relationship with God, and that the center of the church has to be there, as it were, in the people. So crucial to the church coming closer, giving flesh, if you like, to this idea in Lumen Gentium of the people of God, is the idea that the people, we as a people, are being called into being. In Evangelii Gaudium, he talks about the building of a people where differences are harmonized within a shared pursuit. So under John Paul II and Benedict, this understanding of the church of the people of God was, I think, obscured by the assertion of the church as communion, as communio, that the fundamental idea of Vatican II was this idea of communion. And at least in the articulation of this under John Paul II, was to diminish the ecclesiological implications of Lumen Gentium, above all in synodality. So that the idea of the church of the people of God and synodality are essential to each other. They go together. So the recovery of the understanding of the people of God, not as an idea, but actually as a practice, as a form of being church under Francis, lies at the heart of what I think is the big shift of this pontificate. Now he often says, he often said it as a Jesuit, but again it's there in Lumen Gentium, that the people of God is infallible in its believing, infallibilitas in credendo. That if you want to know what the church teaches, you go to the magisterium. But if you want to know if you want to know what the church believes, you go to the magisterium. But if you want to know how the church believes, then you go to the people of God. And that's why the people are the ones who evangelize. The people of God evangelizes itself. He says this in Evangelii Gaudium, that the people of God evangelizes itself. That the Holy Spirit has showered gifts and graces among the faithful, and that, therefore, if you like, the institution is at the service of the people of God coming into being and evangelizing. Now, in a way, this is easier to understand when we think about what the opposite of that is, when we consider what the church looks like when it forgets this theological truth that it's the people of God. And it's the tragedy, in a way, with which we're familiar. An institution which, at its worst, would be clericalist, introverted, imperial, haughty, self-referential, aristocratic, worldly, even indeed abusive. We've lived through the sex abuse crisis, which is fundamentally a crisis of clericalism, or a symptom of clericalism. So to say that Francis has made the defeat of this perversion of the church one of the central tasks of his pontificate, in a way is saying something of the obvious. And so much of the early chapters of this book are about, which are about the financial reform in Rome and the reform to governance, but above all, his seeking to change the culture of the Curia is really all about this. He's doing it, in other words, not simply for the sake of the institution, but rather to restore the church to what it truly is. So the obstacle to pastoral conversion is essentially ideology. It's the idea of a kind of self-sufficient institution, and it is that which ultimately separates the institution of the church from the people of God. This is an idea which back in the 1970s he spoke about often. He would talk about how left and right, reactionaries and revolutionaries, ideologues, if you like, failed to understand the true center of history, the real movement which is going on among God's faithful people. This is a quote: "Thus they fail to join in the march of history where God is saving us. God is making us a body, an institution. God's power enters history so as to make of humans a single body." I was asked to give a paper in Rome just before the Synod on, it was a lovely conference, a Latin American conference celebrating 40 years of the document of Puebla of 1979. And I was given the title, I didn't choose it, "The Novelty of a Latin American Pope." And I said there that I took it for granted that not everything in this pontificate is novel, and what is novel in this pontificate is not necessarily the result of him being Latin American. But I also said that it was very hard to imagine that the response that his pontificate is giving to the crisis of evangelization in the Western Church of our time could have come out of the United States or Europe. And I say this because in Latin America, there is still el pueblo, there is still the faithful people. There is still a substratum, if you like, of the population where one can say there is a tradition there of popular religiosity. And secondly, of course, because Latin America, uniquely in the world church, has a long tradition of synodality, of synods, like nowhere else in the church, because of its transnational episcopal body known as CELAM, which, those of you know, had its first famous synod. There was one before, but the first famous great general conference was in 1968 in Medellin, but really which reaches its full expression in two great meetings, Puebla in 1979, and of course Aparecida in 2007 in Brazil. And then you can see in all of these general conferences the Latin American church developing and deepening its understanding of the pueblo de Dios, the people of God. And the last of these, in Aparecida, carried out what I've said here, and I've said it elsewhere, is what I believe was the most profound signs of the times discernment that the church was doing anywhere in the world. It was also the only really modern example of a contemporary regional synodal process. I mean, really, in Europe there is a body which is similar to CELAM, but it's really never had the effectiveness of the Latin Americans. Those who lived through the Aparecida conference, and Jorge Mario Bergoglio was a chief architect of that conference, talk about it as a kind of Pentecost event. So that the Latin American bishops arrived at the start of it in May 2007, rather desolate. They were full of concerns and anxieties over all the things that trouble the church in the Western world. The expulsion of Christianity from law and culture, the difficulty in communicating the faith across generations, the challenge of poverty and inequality, and so on. So they arrived, if you like, feeling rather down in the dumps, as we would say in England. But there was a transformation. At the end of those 2 weeks, they were filled with a kind of parousia, with a evangelical courage and fervor, and a desire to go out and evangelize. And the result of that, the transformation that resulted, was really the result of this method that they employed, which was to look upon, it's called see, judge, act in Latin America. But Bergoglio Francis has reformulated as contemplate, discern, and propose. And it begins with looking with the gaze of faith on the world, on humanity, and then to speak freely about where is God present in all of this, and how the church can better evangelize in these new circumstances. So what I want to suggest to you is that the reason that Aparecida worked so well was that it was, well, first of all, preceded by a lot of consultation of the people of God, a lot of meetings prior to the actual meeting in Aparecida. It was a process that really lasted 4 or 5 years, of consultations. It was about listening. It was about being in dialogue with the people of God, the people on the front line, the people who are actually living Christian faith. And that there was a process of listening within the General Conference and a process of discernment that allowed the Holy Spirit to open up new ways of thinking for them. So it wasn't just a meeting, it wasn't like an academic conference, it was a method. And this is the method that is now being developed under this Pope, which we're seeing in the synods in Rome, this see, judge, act, or contemplate, discern, propose method. Looking with the eyes of the Good Shepherd, with the eyes of faith on the world and on humanity, and asking, what is the Holy Spirit asking of us? And then doing that discernment, that judging, and then finishing with these proposals. But the key question here about this is that the church is saying, how do we, the church, need to change in order to evangelize contemporary modernity? Now that's the fact that you're asking that question is the discernment question. Too often the church has lamented and condemned what's been happening in modernity and retreated into itself, rather than asking how do we need to change in order to evangelize. So what a parricida, when Francis said to me he didn't have a plan in 2013 when he was elected, he's right, he didn't have a plan, but he did have a discernment. He had the fruit of that discernment of a parricida. And what did a parricida do? What did a parricida say? Well, first of all, a parricida looked at modernity and they saw a dissolution of the bonds of belonging. They saw fragmentation. They saw institutions being undermined by technocratic modernity, by globalization. They saw the expulsion of Christianity from law and culture, secularization. But they also saw that the church, in response to this, had withdrawn into itself behind its own walls, taking refuge in its institutions, lamenting and condemning. And the Parricida in the final document condemns that. They deplore that stance. They say this is not the way we trust Christ. It's a bit like when Peter is invited to leave the boat in the Gospel of Luke in the middle of the storm, and he only looks at the waves, right? He takes his eyes off Jesus, looks at the waves, and falls and drowns, or begins to drown, and then Jesus gets him to look at Christ, and then he's able to be rescued. So in other words, to refocus on Christ rather than on the threats, and to ask, how do we need to change? So what Parricida discerned was the need to put Christ back in the center. That what Christ was asking, what the Holy Spirit was asking of the church in this time, was not to retreat behind its walls, but rather to go out. The idea of the Iglesia en salida, the church that goes out, that's focused on the peripheries, that again focuses on Christ rather than on itself. And this is very clear in the Parricida document, and that enables the participation and the protagonism of the people of God, right? In which everybody, all the faithful, assume the task of evangelization as missionary disciples. So this implies, and a very strong theme of this pontificate, which we've just seen a lot in the Amazon Synod, it implies inculturation. It implies the church being willing to, as it were, shed those things which hold it back from being inserted into the life of the people. It means closeness, it means respect. It means understanding that the church needs to be with the people, if you like, and not with the empire. So if you think about the gospel, Jesus is with the people rather than with the representatives of the empire or the religious elites. That this coming into being, this calling into being of the people, doesn't reject or replace human culture, but brings it to fruition, allows it to be more of what it's called to be. So for Francis, the great contribution of Vatican II was that it enabled the church to be enculturated again, to enter into history and into the life of the people. And that when the church is close in this way, when it is enculturated, when it serves the people, rather than lording it over them, it creates culture, it evangelizes, it creates new ways of being. When it fails to be close, when it lords it over, as it were, people, when it's contemptuous of culture, then it fails to evangelize because it contradicts the very incarnation that it's seeking to preach. When the church as an institution turns its back on the people, it's like an oligarchy pursuing its own interest rather than serving the common good. And in an address once in Buenos Aires Cathedral in 2002, Bergoglio once talked about the story, the gospel story of Zacchaeus, the short of stature tax collector, you all know the story, who after encountering Jesus promises to give back what he's taken from the people. Bergoglio sees in this story of Zacchaeus, Jesus inviting Zacchaeus out of his self-sufficiency, out of, if you like, a false personality that he's constructed on the basis of his wealth. Zacchaeus' conversion is now that Zacchaeus chooses to work patiently with, alongside, the people that he had formerly distanced himself from. He's now become part of the people because he's renounced his arrogance and his separateness. So he remains a tax collector, but with a very different mentality, one that serves rather than exploits. He who was, and this is the term, anti-pueblo, is now pueblo. So this is very important because people often ask, where is the people? Who is the people in the theology of the people? And the answer is, it's not a socioeconomic category. It's a mindset that that clericalism is ultimately the sin of withdrawing from the people into itself. Clericalism, in other words, is anti-pueblo. It's the refusal to belong to the people of God. It's a form of elitism that's tempted to evangelize, as Francis says, for the people, but without the people. All for the people, but not with the people. So this is the liberal, enlightened conception of evangelization, which he's often criticized. And that's in Evangelii Gaudium. So clericalism isn't just a failure to evangelize, it's also a kind of corruption. It's a corruption of the point of the priesthood, which is one of service, is corrupted so that it becomes a way of profiting from the people of God rather than serving them. So in attacking this spiritually worldly, elitist, aristocratic and self-referential attitude, Francis has often spoken about, he's contrasted the stance of Jesus and the religious elites of his day, and I find this quite helpful. So he has an early writing as a Jesuit where he says, why is it that Jesus bypassed the religious authorities of his day? So we have the different groups, don't we? We have the Pharisees, we have the Sadducees who've been appearing in the gospel recently, we have the Zealots, we have the temple authorities, we have the doctors of the law. Why is it that Jesus, as it were, isn't part of any of those, but rather goes straight to the people? And his answer is that all those groups, in their different ways and for different reasons, were focused on, as it were, turning the faith of the people to themselves. They were arrogating the faith of the people for their own benefit. They were focused on maintaining and defending something that they were benefiting from. They were seeking to control it and denying the people their protagonism. So that in challenging his disciples, Jesus was constantly asking them to change their lens, not to be like the doctors of the law, but rather to go in among the people, to be with the people, to learn that it wasn't just a matter of law and doctrine to be applied, but rather they had to know the people, live among them, to be attentive to the grace present in their lives, in the words of Amoris Laetitia. So all of this shift is what I'm arguing is at the heart of the Francis pontificate, the big change, the big conversion to which he's calling the church. Now, synods play a key role in this in, I think, 5 ways. Here are 5 suggestions in which Francis is helping to convert the church in this way. Firstly, the synod, and I'm talking here about the 2 family synods of 2014 and 15. We again had the synod on youth in 2018, and we've just had the synod on Amazonia now, that they embed the method of see, judge, act, or contemplate, discern, propose that I was talking about earlier, which is fundamental to the Latin American path of synodality. That is actually the process, that is the method which they use. Secondly, they always start with this gaze of the Good Shepherd. So they start with looking compassionately out on the world, and particularly at where is the poverty, where is the suffering, where are the wounds of humanity that the church needs to be closer to. So in the case of the family synod, there was a lot of attention to the plight of the divorced and remarried, people who were alienated from the church because of their personal situation. In the case of Amazonia, it's very clear, the church wanted to look at the wounds of Amazonia, the suffering of the indigenous people of the Amazon, but also the natural world which was threatened by economic interests and so on. So it starts with the gaze of the Good Shepherd, and it asks, where are the wounds, where are the vulnerabilities? Thirdly, the objective of the synods is not to change doctrine, as so many conservative critics suspect, but rather to look at how the church can be better present to the human reality which it's looking at. So how can the church come closer to this reality? Interestingly, just now in the Amazonia Synod, Francis, in his first speech, said that the pastoral dimension was the most essential one. It was the more important than all the others. And he urged the Synod Fathers to look with the eyes of disciples and missionaries, to face the reality of the Amazon and its people with a pastoral heart, respecting their culture, their wisdom, their self-awareness, yeah? And to recognize them as protagonists of their own history. And he warned against a kind of colonial mentality, ideological colonizations, what he called a homogenizing centralism, which he says always prevents the seeds of the gospel taking root. So the object is to, as it were, be better present with a compassionate heart and with eyes that avoid that feeling of superiority, that elitism. Fourthly, the synods are a mechanism of discernment above all. So famously at the beginning of the Family Synod of 2014, Francis said to the Synod Fathers, speak boldly, say whatever you like, and listen carefully. And that's really, Jesuits immediately recognized that as the ingredients of the method that they call discernment in common. So by speaking freely and by listening carefully, and by debating and by discussion, but in that way that's very attentive, you allow the Holy Spirit to enter the process and to open up new ways of thinking. So all of these synods have what might call knotty pastoral issues to consider. And it's very interesting to see those of us who've been present at the synod, you always see the same thing. At the beginning of the synod, people go in saying, I don't know how we can square this. So famously in the Family Synod, they said, how do we uphold the doctrine of indissolubility of marriage, which is supported by sacramental law? And on the other hand, how do we integrate the divorced and remarried into parish life, including possibly sacramental life? How do we square that? A bit like with the Amazon too. People said, okay, the church needs to be present in the Amazon. The Amazon people are asking for access to the sacraments. How can the church do that without ordaining married men? But then if they ordain married men, how do we keep the important principle of celibacy, which is a long tradition in the Western church? So I'm just giving examples of knotty issues which they go in on. And it's fascinating to see as the synod goes on, how they begin to see how to square these circles. That what they saw as contradictions were really tensions or contrasts which actually allowed for a new way of thinking. And in my chapter 9, by the way, I have a detailed account of the Family Synod in which I document that process. It's a kind of fly-on-the-wall account of what happened in the two synods and the conversion that took place, pastoral conversion. And then lastly, the last thing I think these synods manage to do is that they unite people. They have a uniting effect on people. So this is the element of the people of God that is formed, that comes into being by this synodality. Francis is asking us as a church to embrace synodality as a means of being. I know it's a funny word. It comes from the Greek synodos, meaning to walk together. That's all it means. That we walk together, we listen to each other, we dialogue, we discern. And that in so doing, we allow the Holy Spirit in. So it's effective in bringing about the unity of the people of God. And I want to suggest to you that that is precisely why the synod is attacked in the way that it has been. If you look back on the history of this pontificate, and I realized in writing the book that the opposition to Francis is a big part of the story of the pontificate. Fascinating to see where the opposition is at its strongest and often most vicious is at those moments when Francis makes the people of God the protagonist, allows the people of God to speak and to show its wounds. That's often where you get the most ferocious attacks. So in the Synod on the Family, it was over the question of divorce and remarried. Look now at the Amazonia Synod, where the people of God of the Amazon were invited to tell the church, what was going on in their lives and how they felt, and there was this summary of their views in what was called the working document. And it was criticized for being heretical. The people of the Amazon came to Rome, they came to pray with the Pope in the Vatican gardens, and they were told that they were pagans and idol worshippers. Their wooden figurine that they brought with them from the Amazon, a beautiful image of a pregnant woman, which is a symbol of fertility and life, no more than that, was thrown into the Tiber, as you know, by an Austrian anti-globalist fanatic. But my point is that these reactions are extraordinary, the viciousness and the hostility. And I want to suggest that it's precisely because it is Francis giving life to this idea of the people of God that is attracting such opposition. I know I'm running out of time now and I'm coming to the end, but I just want to mention where this opposition really comes from in my view. And I want to use a phrase that Bergoglio used a lot as a Jesuit, rather less as a cardinal and hardly ever as pope, but I think it's quite powerful. He talked about the isolated conscience. It's actually in Evangelii Gaudium, right at the beginning in paragraph 2, but it's been mistranslated, as so often with this pope, as blunted conscience, isolated conscience, conciencia aislada in Spanish. Very important idea, the isolated conscience of the people who are withdrawn from the people of God. So in the beginning of Evangelii Gaudium, he talks about the joy of the gospel filling the hearts and the lives of all those who encounter Jesus. And he encouraging the Christian faithful to embark upon this great task of evangelization, of going out. But then in paragraph 2, he points out the obstacle to this, which is the isolated conscience. Born, he says, of desolation and anguish and various other things. Back in 2007, this is in the same year of Aparecida, he gave a wonderful interview in which he talked about the prophet Jonah. You know the story of the prophet who God asked to go. Jonah was really fleeing was the mercy of God. He couldn't stand the idea that there was a possibility of conversion and change for the people of Nineveh. Jonah was the classic religious person who's righteous, who does the right thing, who's moral and who's good, and who has the satisfaction of knowing that there are lots of people who are not like him, not righteous and not upstanding. And that gives him great comfort. So, of course, when God breaks that, it upsets him. So Jonah knew nothing of God's ability to lead his people with the heart of the Father, says Bergoglio. And this, he says, is the risk of the isolated conscience of those who, quote, from the closed world of their Tarshishes, complain about everything, or feeling their identity threatened, undertake battles to feel more busy and involved, end of the quote. So this is what I want to suggest lies at the heart of the resistance to this papacy, is an isolated conscience, a distrustful self-withholding of the papacy, a refusal to be part of the march of the people of God in history. And you'll notice that the opponents of this pope, the famous ones, and there's never more than a few dozen, they've just written another letter today, it's the same names that come up time and time again, are usually academics, they're usually intellectuals, they're a few cardinals, a few bishops. In other words, they're members of kind of elites, if you like, who are withdrawn from the people of God and who want to judge the Pope and indeed the people. So the attack fundamentally is on the body. What Francis is seeking to do is to bring about the people of God, to form it into the body of Christ. This is the incarnation itself that he's seeking, that the church helps to bring about in the contemporary world. And the attack is precisely on the principle of the incarnation. The attack is on the body of the people of God. Ultimately, I think the great success, the great test of the pontificate of this reform is if the church becomes more like what it seeks to proclaim. So the Pope at the end of this synod on the Amazonia, he was very happy with the way the synod worked out. And he talked about how important was the diagnoses that the synod made. In other words, how well the synod had managed to look upon the reality of the Amazon. And what he meant was that the synod had emulated the divine means of salvation. How does God choose to save us? It's through the cincta basis, the coming down in order to come close. That this is the heart of the Francis reform, to create a church whose way of evangelizing emulates this salvific action of God, that is always coming close, walking alongside, saving and integrating. All the great works of this pontificate, the reforms in Rome, which I document here, the criteria for picking of cardinals and bishops, the synods, of course, the actions, the gestures of the Pope himself are all geared fundamentally to this end, to bring the church closer, above all, to the wounds of humanity, emulating the action of God. I've been delighted to see, as I'm sure many of you have, that the Bishop of San Diego, McElroy, wonderful man who I met recently in Rome, has done a superb lecture. I don't know whether you've seen it. It's up at National Catholic Reporter. He was part of the Amazonia Synod, and he's come back saying this is what the American church needs above all. And he has the same diagnosis as Aparecida, that the American church has turned in on itself in response to secularization and tribulation. And he sees the synodal path, the synod, as the way through, the way out, the way of opening up new ways of thinking in the church that allows the church again to evangelize and create culture in the United States. And he identifies, of course, the symptom of the church's self-referentiality in its polarization. A polarized church is incapable of evangelizing because it has failed to be formed into a people. It has not lost. It is no longer responding to the Spirit which is seeking to build us into one. So the way out of that is to allow the Holy Spirit back in through a synodal process, listening to each other, allowing the Holy Spirit to open up new paths and new ways of thinking. And I just want to end with his own words. This is McElroy. The great danger is that our ecclesial life is becoming like our political life, polarized, distorted, and tribal. That's why a deep and broad process of synodal dialogue within the Catholic community could empower an alternative pathway forward. Dialogue, encounter, and unity are more important to our nation at this moment than any single issue we face, because such a stance of encounter is in itself the foundation for any genuine pursuit of the common good. So he's seeing, as Francis has said, is that as the church develops its own synodal method, its own way of being synodal, it could become a great example for a world, for a society, for a politics, which is again seeking the way out of polarization and to renew, if you like, the commitment of politics and society to a project of the common good. So that, I want to suggest, is not just the source of the evangelizing vigor of this pontificate, but also the reason why this pontificate is increasingly a reference point for the whole of humanity. Thank you very much. Sorry to go on. Sorry, I went on a bit. So.
Okay, we have time to make a good 20-25 minutes to have a dialogue here. I'll start maybe kind of hopefully prompt some of your thinking as well from this wonderful talk that Austen gave us, and about Bishop McElroy, who was with us a couple of years ago, and we sat down for a nice 35-minute conversation on these topics. He's an astute political mind, Stanford educated, a great political theorist, and a great bishop. He's putting his money where his mouth is with synodality in young adults. He's just given the young adults of San Diego, the Diocese of San Diego, he is listening to them. They wrote a charter for what they want for the diocese, and they're putting it into play. You know, it's kind of a new thing, so he's practicing what he preaches. I have an observation, I think it's implicit in your talk, Austen. It's about a kind of Ignatian spirituality, an approach that Pope Francis has, that is a synodality that kind of comes out of a Camino theology, it comes out of an accompaniment theology, and even a frontera theology that Pope Francis practices. Do you think that's accurate? And if so, what kind of obstacles are implicit in that way of imagining the church? Some of which you've already kind of sketched for us.
Yeah, I'm always reluctant when I'm asked about Francis's theological vision, because he's not, I don't think, seeking to impose a theological vision. In a way, one can argue that that was possibly the mistake, if I could use that word, of the John Paul II era, is that the magisterium promoted a particular theology, a particular way of understanding, for example, Vatican II. So at the heart of the theology promoted in the last 30 years has been communio theology, which is that tradition, that group of theologians. Even though Francis is strongly identified with what's known in Latin America or Argentina as the theology of the people, sometimes called theology of culture, and I talk a lot about it in the other book and in this one, very important in helping to form him, but I don't think he's seeking to impose that theology, if you like. I don't think there is a particular theology that is being enshrined in this pontificate. What I think is at the heart of it is what I've talked about, which is a method. So if you like, it's a theological method. So let's call it inductive rather than deductive, historically conscious, see, judge, act, option for the poor, but not the poor understood as a socioeconomic category. In other words, you can say there's a tradition of thinking, and then his own deep thinking, which is drawn, yes, very much from St. Ignatius and the spiritual exercises, the dialectic of the exercises. Also his work on Guardini. Those of you who know Massimo Borghesi's intellectual biography will know how important the whole idea of navigating these tensions, these contrasts and so on. So I think all that's at the heart of that's at the heart of the papacy. That's how he operates as Pope. But as I say, I hesitate to say that there's a particular theology.
That's fair. Any thoughts from the crowd?
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your two recent pieces in Commonweal, the one that Michael Murphy referred to and the one on Newman. That was excellent. I have two questions, but I'm only going to ask one. If there's a chance, I want to ask about Newman. I'm going to hold that back if there's time later. I want to ask about women. In Francis's professed desire to integrate women into more leadership positions in the church, which he's done. But some would criticize and say it's not done enough. And then regarding, it's reported that in the Amazon, women are exercising leadership positions and even doing the sacraments. And then just one last thing to mention to frame this question. The commission that he set up, again, to examine the women's diaconate, that did not reach a consensus. So he didn't feel he could act on their final report, but then I heard talk about enlarging a new commission with more people. So what's your perspective?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, you're very well informed, but just to pick up on the last bit, I'll come back to the overall question about women. But in the Amazon, one of the characteristics of the church in the Amazon is that most Catholics are in communities rather than parishes. So these are like villages, right? And almost all of them don't have a resident priest. 60% of them are run by women. And we had, during the Synod in the press briefings, we had some really, really remarkable women give testimony to life out there. And I mean, some of them were indigenous leaders, but some of them also remarkable nuns, some of them, Brazilian, Ecuadorian, Peruvian, some German, and so on. So it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because the word Amazon comes from the myth of the strong woman, right? But before I get into the female diaconate, what a lot of people missed, and I've tried to bring it out in my second Commonweal piece, is that in the Synod final document, it talks about the presidency of these communities being equally open to men and women, okay? Secondly, that they should be recognized formally by the church, possibly through an imposition of the hands of the bishop, right? So we're talking about a bishop laying on hands, conferring authority. This is pretty radical stuff. In many ways, it's more than a female diaconate, right? So I think what you're seeing opening up in the Amazonia Synod is the recognition of women's ministry, of women's leadership ministry, not necessarily, but not, of course, a sacramental one. On the question of one of the issues that came up in the Synod itself, and it has come up in other synods, is why, so mostly it's just bishops who have the right to vote, but they're also representatives of the religious who have a right to vote, but not the women. So you have non-ordained men having the right to vote, but not women. So this came up, and there was a request from the women saying to the Pope, well, Anyway, he said to them at the end of the Synod, you've thrown down the gauntlet and I want to take it up. And he talked about reopening the commission that was looking into the female diaconate in the early church. He's talked about reforming it with new members under the authority of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Make of that what you will. It seems to be opening up a path. Let's see what happens. Overall on women, I have a few pages, not many, a couple of pages in the curial chapter, which is called A Time to Serve, where I talk about the number of executive positions in the Vatican now occupied by women for the first time. So there are about 6, either secretary or undersecretary roles occupied by women. This is a big deal in Vatican terms. And he has spoken about the importance of women occupying positions of leadership. However, he then almost always says, but let's not make the mistake of believing that simply by doing that we are integrating the voice of the feminine within the church, the feminine voice. Because he says actually what women have to, he keeps saying we haven't yet worked out a proper theology of women which recognizes women's distinctive way of looking, distinctive, right, into the church. So he's talked about integrating women's thinking, so he's expanded the International Theological Commission to include more women. But really, I get asked about this a lot, and I'm not really sure what Francis means. And I'm not sure that he knows what he means. I think what he's doing is he's onto something important. He's intuiting this, and he's almost saying, right, we need to develop this. But he's saying, and I think this is probably quite brilliant on his part, if you simply, I mean, obviously the priesthood, nobody's talking about opening up the priesthood to women, but the diaconate, it's clergy, right? Is it a mistake? Because many of these women in the Synod, by the way, in the Amazon are saying, look, we don't want to be clergy, right? We want to be leaders. We want our leadership recognized and our ministry recognized, but we don't need to be clergy. So I think in all of these questions, there are things being opened up in a way. So I say in the book, and I quote a number of women saying, there is now a conversation in this pontificate about women which was never happening before. But I think we're still a long way from realizing, I think he's right. We're a long way from actually recognizing what women's true place in the church is. But I'm not sure he's that clear about it either. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Dr. Ivereigh.
Hi.
My name is Megan. I'm a graduate student here. I also work in a parish in Chicago, just down the street from St. Mary's. So, by way of a taster, our professor gave us a selection from the Great Reformer, and I wanted to pull out something about the laity that you said in the epilogue. You said, a new congregation for the laity is a virtual certainty, putting the body that represents God's holy, faithful people at the same level as those managing bishops and clergy. And so two of the women who you're referencing here as sub-secretaries, Gambino and I don't know how to say Linda's last name, are actually sub-secretaries in a dicastery.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about how that might have surprised you in writing the Great Reformer and where we are now, and that it's not quite a congregation, and what do you think might have happened there?
Yeah, so, well, in fact, what happened was that when it was created, it opened its doors in 2017, it's called a dicastery, and I don't know whether it's really worth going into this, because it's not really that interesting, but the new bodies that have been created by Francis are called dicasteries. He's abolishing the old distinction between congregations and councils. Now, what that means in practice is that it has teeth. It's an important body. And it's called the Dicastery of Laity, Family and Life. It's headed by Cardinal Farrell. The number 2 in the congregation is a Brazilian priest. And many people were a bit disappointed by that because they thought actually having a woman who was an undersecretary there. I know from conversations with Cardinal Farrell that he had in mind one woman in particular that in America that he would have loved to have appointed an undersecretary. Now but it's interesting, he then went on to tell me, and this shines a lot of light about the difficulties of Vatican reform. A woman of that quality, a professional with a family, to bring over from the United States, relocation costs, education, would have cost something like $400,000 a year, right? And there just isn't the budget for that kind of thing. So I think those are the realities in conversation with Farrell and others. I've realized that, the will is there, but actually in practice, like most of the women in reality that get appointed in the Vatican are Italian, and most of them are religious, and of course religious don't command high salaries and so on. So these are some of the complexities of Vatican reform. But I think the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life is a very important dicastery. It's outward facing. He's basically said the concerns of the laity are at the heart of the Vatican's concerns. They're not secondary, and that's really significant. The other one, of course, that he's raised to the same level is now called the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development, which replaces the Justice and Peace. Again, putting things like ecology, migration, peace building right at the heart of the concerns of the Vatican. So the Curia serves the Church, serves the interests of humanity, not just its own institutional prerogatives.
Thank you very much. My name is Bill George. I'm retired professor of theology. I have a question about maybe the subtitle of the book about concern to convert the church. When I read Laudato Si, it seems that he's really concerned about converting the whole world.
Yes.
And kind of another part of that is if the church obviously needs to be converted in various ways laid out.
Yeah.
Does he see that some of that conversion will come from without?
Yeah.
In other words, that there could be people all over who are already converted.
Sure.
And that they can evangelize the church. I'm thinking of a concrete example of a fellow British writer, I think John Maxwell, who wrote a book back in the 70s asking about slavery in the Catholic Church's late coming to this real outright condemnation of the whole institution of slavery. Why did it take so long? He treats this as almost a disaster.
Yeah.
So he wants to see why this is. He gives a number of reasons why he thinks. One of the things that struck me was you said about the index, getting
Yeah.
books. And sometimes they would take authors and just condemn them
Yeah.
for one thing,
Yes.
even though they have a lot of other good things
Yeah.
that they should have been, the church should have been listening to.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question is, do you see in Francis, with this listening you're talking about, as much willingness to listen
Yeah.
to voices outside
Yeah,
the community?
that's right.
As in,
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, just overall, one of the big changes of this pontificate is not so much in what it's done, but what it hasn't done. No theologians have been condemned since the beginning of the Francis pontificate. And various theologians who had reprimands from the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith suddenly find that nobody's written them to say, you know, you can teach now, but they find that when they do teach, it's fine, you know. So something has changed. There used to be a huge outpouring of documents from the Vatican, particularly under John Paul II, just an endless deluge of instructions and directions. Again, that's all dried up. So there's this kind of respect for the local, there's respect for the discernment of the local bishops' conference in questions. And as for kind of looking for, as it were, sources of good in the world outside the church, or as he would put it, the seeds of the word. I mean, I think Laudato Si is a fantastic example of exactly that. For the first time, we have a papal encyclical which starts by listening to science. You know, it says, let's listen to what science has to tell us. Now, I say I have a whole chapter on Laudato Si, and I've set out to answer the question which hasn't been answered yet and elsewhere, which is where did it come from? Because when I wrote the biography came out in 2014, and shortly after it came out, it was announced that there would be this ecology encyclical. And my first reaction was, how the heck did I miss that? You know, having studied almost, I thought, everything he had written and so on and said in Buenos Aires as Archbishop, I thought, why? And I checked with friends back in Argentina, and they said, no, he didn't talk about it. But then when I came to do this research, you can see his growing awareness of the issue, coming really from the experience of being in the shanty towns and seeing the effects directly on the poor of global capitalism. And then the other thing I talk about a lot here is there was a big dispute over a paper mill in a place in Argentina with a very sonorous name of Gualeguaychú, which is over the river from Uruguay. So there's this big spat between Uruguay and Argentina over, and he came, again, that was a major breakthrough for him. And in Aparecida, so I tell the story of how he becomes increasingly aware. And he appoints, as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, an expert actually on climate change to advise the bishops. Right? So this is a scientist who he's asking to advise them. I just think these are important steps to showing that here is a man who's very, very attentive to listening from the outside. The other thing he's done a lot, and you see it in Laudato Si, if you look at the footnotes, you see a lot of the references are to local bishops' conference documents. This is, again, a big shift, is the collegiality. He listens to the margins and to the bishops. And another example of that would be, and I talk a lot about his changes to the College of Cardinals, that he's no longer appointing cardinals just from big metropolitan cities, but also from very remote places within the church, places which have, you know, few Catholics, and they're people on the front line, often of interreligious dialogue, conflict, and so on. Why has he appointed those cardinals? Because what he wants at the next conclave is for the voice of the periphery of humanity to be felt and heard actually in the conclave, because he's convinced that that's where the Holy Spirit is speaking to the church. So anyway, they're just some examples of. Go on. Yes, thank you. Exactly. That's why he called the Synod on the Youth, precisely. And he told me actually when we met that he's convinced that there's something about the young people and old people need to be brought into dialogue with each other. That there's something about the dreams of the young and the wisdom of the old connecting. Very important. No, he really is a pope who listens. I mean, listening is a big part of this pontificate. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for your presentation tonight and your writings.
Thank you.
Help us understand.
Thank you.
Francis.
Thank you. That's the mission. That's the mission. So thank you.
It's an encouragement.
Thank you.
One of the questions I have is, you had mentioned the importance of this Jesuit spirituality, discernment, see, judge, act, and so on. One of that's an important perspective that he certainly radiates. But one of the things that struck me is how biblical his writing
Yes.
and speaking is.
Yes.
His homilies, and then in the major texts that we've been talking about, I'm thinking on matrimony, he has a whole chapter when she does exegesis of 1 Corinthians 13. And I think that when I hear people appreciating Francis, they appreciate his concreteness and his imagery. And it's thoroughly biblical.
Yeah.
There's a kind of accessibility
That's right.
of his writings for that reason. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but
Well, only to agree. I think that's exactly right. Somebody pointed out to me, and I'd never thought about this, that popes in general didn't used to give homilies on the gospel. Apparently, they would always usually focus on the letters. Francis always speaks about the gospel. I mean, in the daily masses. And I mean, I've never understood this idea that he's creating confusion. I find him a compellingly clear teacher, amazingly clear. And he speaks with the clarity of the gospel. I mean, he really has shown forth Christ in our time. He's soaked in the gospel. One of the things, and I talk about it here, is that, again, popes generally have never talked about Pharisees and Pharisaism, except to say that the Pharisees were selective about the doctrine on marriage. Francis has given a number of homilies, and I say in the book, this is kind of quite daring eggshell territory for a pope to go into, where he talks about the Pharisaism in the church, and he gives this very compelling homily in the Consistory of Cardinals in February 2015, where he's talking about the Jesus among the lepers, and he's saying there are two ways in the church, tradition. There have been two ways of acting and being: those who want to preserve the saved and those who want to save the lost. I think I've got that right. He gives this whole homily saying basically that there are these two hermeneutics, these two ways of being. And obviously Jesus is the good shepherd. He always wants to save the lost. But very challenging stuff to a whole group of cardinals to say that. Again, in Medellin, he gives a wonderful homily where he talks about Jesus needing to cure the disciples of their own legalism by taking them among the wounded and the... This is absolutely the heart of the gospel. But what's so interestingly is in the last chapter, which is on, I've called Mercy and its Discontents, because I think mercy is where he touches on the heart of the gospel. And that's again where he provokes the great opposition. So I talk about somebody called Phil Lawler. Have you heard of Phil Lawler as a writer? He's kind of very conservative. So he wrote a whole book called Lost Shepherd. Some people think this is a response to it. It's not. But Lost Shepherd, and he starts off by this homily that Francis gave in the Santa Marta on Jesus confronting the Pharisees over marriage, right? You read Francis's homily, and it's brilliant, but very conventional orthodox exegesis on the mercy, how Jesus wants to go beyond the law, right? And this guy Lawler is convinced that Francis is somehow undermining the whole Christian tradition of teaching on marriage. And when you come across this, you have to say, and I've been very struck, I realized I had to account for the opposition to Francis. And I've very daringly gone, in ways that they already don't like. But I've actually ended up drawing comparisons with those confrontations of Jesus with the Pharisees, where they look at him and they suffer from what in the Bible they call invidia. It's a kind of not seeing, right? There's a blindness there. It's from where we get the word envy. But they misinterpret Jesus. They see him as a threat. They recognize his power, they recognize his authority, but they see him as a threat, and of course ultimately they have to try and do away with him because they see him as undermining them and their tradition. And yet the people of God, the ordinary people, see him as God among them, the anointed one of Israel. So ultimately we're talking about a hermeneutic question, the lens in which he's seen. And Francis has elicited, and I've said this, from the Catholic Church, has brought forth, summoned forth a level of, has exposed Pharisaism within the church. And I think that's what we're seeing in the opposition to Francis, which to me is evidence, or if you like, proof that he really is touching on the gospel itself. He is an alter Christus. There we are. I've said it.
Hi. Is there a follow-up? So this may be a little bit earlier in the chronology. It might tie more closely with earlier things you've written than this current book. But my wife spent the first 20 years of her life in Cordoba,
Mm.
in Argentina,
Yeah.
before she left as an economic migrant from Mallorca.
Right.
And so I'm fascinated by his period there,
Yeah.
obviously, for personal reasons.
Yeah.
And so there's something in that experience, sort of akin to an Ignatian Manresa experience, that I believe is sort of programmatic for everything that follows. And so I'm really curious if you could provide some insight or just any kind of, it's still quite mysterious what happened from everything I've read in those years or that period there. And if you have anything to offer on that.
I have to say, these are the classiest questions I've yet had on my tour. I'm loving all of these. Absolutely. Many people would say that his pontificate is the fruit of his exile in Cordoba. So people talk about the exile is really 2 years, 1990 to 1992. In reality, his period of desolation and confrontation with the Society of Jesus in Argentina and worldwide was really from 1987 through to 1992. So he's in his 50s, so he's in midlife. He's been a phenomenally successful provincial and rector. Vocations are booming. In Rome, they're scratching their heads and saying, what the heck is he doing that we're not doing, right? And yet, he's also summoned forth this opposition, which ultimately leads Rome to dislodge him. He suddenly finds himself in his 50s, in Cordoba, with no brief, no responsibilities at all. He takes care of the old people in the house, he listens to confessions, and he experiences a searing desolation. Now, what's fascinating is that in his early writings, and I love his Jesuit writings, there are 3 volumes of them, and I still don't understand to this day why they haven't been published in English. And here I am offering again, I will happily edit them and help translate them if somebody wants to publish them. They're absolutely astonishing pieces of writing, a lot of which are about leadership, and they're Ignatian leadership stuff, right? Brilliant things, right? And yet, I think it's only when he had it all taken away from him in Cordoba, when he experienced this complete powerlessness and saw the results of his leadership being undone before his eyes, only then did he really understand the true power at work in the world, which is the power of God, right? Because he begins to understand that real change comes out through paciencia, through the embrace or the acceptance of limitation and powerlessness. And so, you know, so much of his leadership of the church now, there's this astonishing faith in, he talks about it, the processes. He talks about opening up processes. So that he's guiding the church, but the one who's really in charge of the church is Christ, is the Holy Spirit. And so it's this cooperation with the true power in the universe, which is kenosis, which is the story of the incarnation. And there's one book in particular, I talk about it a lot in chapter 2 here, by a Jesuit called John Navone, who wrote a book called Teologia del Fallimento, Theology of Failure, great title, A Theology of Failure, which is all about how Christ saves through failure and powerlessness. And anyway, so thank you for the question. I actually think, and these are people very close to Francis, who have said to me, he wouldn't be Pope were it not for that period of complete desolation. So there's a bit of hope for all of us when things are really tough. You never know what's being, you know, what seeds are being sown for the future in our desolation and our powerlessness. Thank you.
So for those of us following along with the U.S. Bishops meeting taking place this week, we heard a wonderful pep talk from Archbishop Pierre to the bishops,
Yes.
Inviting them, challenging them to kind of get on board with the pastoral vision and priorities of Pope Francis. And then today there was a vote to whether or not to integrate some of the language into the new faithful citizenship, which did not pass. What would you say is Pope Francis's vision for how to convert the leadership of the U.S. Church? How does he view that particular project?
Okay, you're going to get me into trouble here.
That was the goal.
I mean, as you know, I don't know whether you know, but the US bishops have already put out a statement against the book, because on page 174, I describe something which is actually very true and very well known, which is that the Secretariat of the USCCB sought to draw up anti-abuse plans and basically to bounce Rome into accepting them. And the statement they put out was very curious, because they accused me of making out that the bishops were in some way at odds with the Pope. And I never say that in the book, and I would never say it, because the bishops, it's a big bishops' conference, and there are many bishops that are really wonderfully in communion with Francis. Not many, but they're very important people who really get Francis. I've mentioned McElroy, your own bishop here obviously plays a leading role. The way I would describe the US Bishops' Conference is probably there is about a quarter, I don't know, maybe 20%, something like that, of the US bishops who I think suffer from this isolated conscience that I was talking about. So that they view Francis through this filter of suspicion. And, you know, in a way, the proof of it was when Archbishop Vigano called upon the Pope to resign. And quite a few of them put out statements saying Vigano's a very nice, reasonable chap. We should take him seriously. And in no way did they express any, you know, a disagreement with the call on the Pope to resign, which is astonishing for bishops. So, you know, I mean, the Pope himself has talked about schism, as you know, on the plane. And I think there is a semi-schismatic mentality in part of the Bishops' Conference. But I think that's a minority. So I think you've got a minority. I think in the middle, most of them are living, you know, in a way with their backs to Rome. And I think there's an isolation here, an institutional focus. I think McElroy nails it really well. What I'm really delighted by is that right now there is the ad limina visit in Rome of the US bishops. And this is the first time that the US bishops have gone on an ad limina under this Pope, right? And they're going, and I've just been following on Twitter some of their reactions, and they're astonished, as all bishops are when they go to Rome these days, and again I talk about this in the book, that they used to be treated like altar boys, now they go and the dicasteries say to them, how can we help you? You know, Pope Francis has asked us to listen to you, and they're like, oh, this is amazing. And then they go and have a meeting with Francis, and they have these astonishing two-hour dialogues, free-flowing, you know, where Francis is helping them to just, you know, and I don't know these bishops very well. You know, I don't know the US, but I'm looking at these tweets and I'm thinking they're completely bowled over. So I have great hope of that, because I think for a lot of these bishops, when they go to Rome and they see Francis and they meet him in the flesh, they will hopefully overcome something of their isolated conscience. Let's hope.
Our friend Sam Sorge, our videographer.
Thank you. My question is about your personal spiritual response to following the Pope's life, and most particularly about his response to critics, how you then respond to your own critics,
yeah.
And then how we who inherit the body, you know, or in the church, how we can respond with the same spirituality.
Yeah. Thank you. That's another beautiful question. I think Francis shows us how to act and communicate in a context of polarization. And I've written an article with Diego Fares for Civiltà Cattolica called How to Communicate in a Polarized Society, where I take some of Francis's own responses and I show how, in a very discerning way, he doesn't allow himself to get caught up in what we might call the mimetic contagion of the, right, which we're all very familiar with on Twitter, that we all get into these tribal wars, battles. And I think he's a genius at that. His non-response, his choosing not to respond to Vigano, his choosing not to respond to the Jubia, but rather to allow the people of God to discern the spirits involved. You know, he gives the guidance, I think is all exemplary. If you're asking me how well I apply this in my own life, and particularly my life on social media, I would have to confess not very well. I'm better than I was, but I get scandalized by the opposition to Francis, and I find myself wanting to respond to it. And I often ask myself whether that's the right thing or not. I mean, I see my own role as helping to explain the pontificate, you know, particularly to the Anglo-Saxon world. And so I try and respond in a way that I think helps people to do their own judgment of where this resistance is coming from. But I'm very aware of the mimetic contagion and the polarization that happens on social media. I don't really understand Facebook. I'm really only on Twitter. But I'm definitely better than I was. I used to get really drawn into the weeds of it, you know, and I'm better at standing back from it. But I think there's a project to be done, and I hope that will maybe be my next project, on exploring some of the Pope's thinking, particularly his thinking as a Jesuit, his discernment about apostolic bodies in times of tribulation, which is brilliant, and drawing out some of the lessons for that, leadership lessons for us and our institutions in an increasingly polarized environment. I feel instinctively that there's a great contribution at this moment that Pope Francis has to make to our times, which has to do with that. And I'm beginning to think it through.
That's a first-class response, if I may say. And I'll say now, because it's interesting you use the word mimetic contagion. Sam's actually finishing up a film on Rene Girard.
Oh,
And I've seen the trailer for it in the dailies, and it's going to be beautiful. We have time for a couple more, so anybody else?
Hi, Dr. Ivereigh. My name is An, and I feel really blessed to be here because as Vietnamese people from far away in Asia, just to hear how you talk about Pope Francis and just to see like his vision, and he captured like his life as not only in Argentina but also like as a Latino, and all of that spirit that really came out of it. I struggle with my own faith or my own self-discerning in terms of like what would it be like for what the church in, I don't want to talk big like Asia, of course there's so many countries, but now I'm only thinking about my own country, is Vietnam, where yes, vocation is booming, yes, where there are tremendous growth of faith and a lot of like enduring, a lot of just like self-quiet faith, and hearing what you're talking about, the sense of like the Synod, synodality, kind of the spirit of that. Like I cannot say that we have that in terms of like I cannot give what we don't have in terms of like I'm still searching for like what is that spirit that the Vietnamese people have, or maybe Asian people have, because like I'm just inspired, really inspired by the people in Latin America has that spirit, and how Pope Francis bring it out. So I guess my question is, if you will, I don't know, maybe a guess, or perhaps if you happen to pick Pope Francis' brain a little bit, what is his vision for the church in Asia?
Yeah. Gosh, of course, one of the things about Francis is that he's opened up Asia in a way. If you look at the number of trips, he's about to go, is it next week, isn't it, to Thailand and Japan. And he's been, of course, to Korea, he's been to... so he's been very encouraging of the Asian church. I think he's convinced that the Church of Asia and the Church of Africa are the future. Unquestionably, if you look at the rates of growth, Korea, of course, then in many ways the future is Asian in the church. I mean, just the number of Christians in China alone is astonishing. One of his great ambition, of course, is to go to China. China and Russia would make it. That would make him very happy if he could go to both those places. And of course, the opening up of China, the accord of the Holy See with China, which we still don't know a lot about. A lot of it's secret, but is a remarkable breakthrough. Everybody says it's astonishing breakthrough, which for the first time brings Beijing and Rome into dialogue over bishops' appointments. So I think his vision for the church in Asia, he's very aware that the Spirit is moving in the Asia, that this is the future. I think for the time being, the way I see the universal church at the moment, first of all, Francis is the first Pope of a new global era for the Catholic Church. So the center of gravity has now shifted. This is no longer a European church. It's no longer a northern church, even though it might still look like it. And by the way, wonderful to see Archbishop Gomez has just been made president of the USCCB, a Mexican in origin, again reflecting the shift within the United States towards the Southwest. But I do think that for the time being, Latin America will be the center. At the moment, Latin America is the kind of the source for the universal church, in the way that France and Germany were at the time of Vatican II, Italy and Spain were at the time of the Council of Trent, Jerusalem was. So we have the center of gravity in the church has shifted. I think it's in Latin America, and I think it will continue to be for the time being. Now, I don't necessarily mean that the next Pope will be Latin American, although I think it's a good chance, but more likely that the vision of Aparecida translated into Evangelii Gaudium is the vision for the future, is the discernment for the coming generation. Why do I say that? Because there is nothing else like it out there. The church in nowhere in the world has developed the depth of discernment that they have in Latin America. And therefore, I'm fairly confident in saying that. But I think Asia will play an increasingly important role in the global church in coming years. And Francis is certainly seeking to encourage that with these visits and his appointments to the College of Cardinals, of course, many of which are Asian. Thank you.
Okay, last one for Father Bernardi.
My question concerns John Henry Newman, beatified by Pope Benedict and recently canonized by Pope Francis, with a shout out to your piece in the November issue of Commonweal. What resources in Newman, I could summarize your article, but I'll let you do it. What resources in Newman for this moment that might bridge some of the tensions in the church?
Well, you know, I was out there for the canonization because it took place during the Synod, and it was actually, as a British Catholic, it was a really beautiful event. It was this very, very special British Catholic moment. I managed to get an English Dominican nun smuggled me into the post-canonization party up on the Collegio Urbano, which was just fantastic. So the Prince of Wales was there and everything. And I ended up sort of about the distance from me from that chair from the Prince of Wales, just after the choir of the Newman College School had sung this gorgeous motet. And then Prince Charles talked about Newman as this great British Catholic saint, and talked about how he helps to overcome disagreement and teaches us how to disagree. And I thought this is astonishing. It's one of those moments where the Reformation completely disappears, and you think, gosh, we're really... And a lot of people, and what was interesting about the canonization was that Newman attracts in Britain very conservative characters, but also people, like me. And I think, and I said at the end of this article, it was more of an intuition really, I haven't thought it through properly, but again, Newman is a figure who can help to overcome the polarization of our time. He believes passionately in truth, right? In that sense, he's no liberal, right? But on the other hand, he believes passionately in the freedom to pursue that truth and the conscience, the ever-seeking conscience, restless like Augustine. Again, and I said in the article, particularly in a post-truth environment where the epistemological question, can we trust, the truth, is really at the heart of our postmodern crisis, our own distrustful self-withholding of the postmodern self, that Newman can help to overcome that. So somehow, this is just an intuition. We journalists and writers, we never let lack of knowledge get in the way of our speculation. But there's something in the Francis Guardini stuff about polar, and there's something in the Newman epistemological stuff. There could be something important being born there, which will help to guide a fractured and polarized world. Thank you.
Okay, 2 observations and then some details. Observation 1, you provided us with a superb talk.
Thank you.
Observation 2, a great audience and excellent dialogue.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Let's all put our hands together for Austen Ivereigh.
Thank you. Thank you.